Charles says, hey, Austin and Robert, I have a question about my Roth IRA strategy. For context, I'm a realtor in Tennessee. Go Vols. I'm 27 years old, and I have $120,000 worth of stocks and cryptocurrency in my bridge account. I have 4 rental units, which I've slowly built up through house hacking, and about $16,000 in my Roth IRA, which I'm maxing out every year. I also have a solid emergency fund equal to 3 months of expenses. Now, my Roth IRA question is this. My allocation is being split between the 5 index funds you guys always talk about, VOO, VGT, QQQ, MOAT, and AIQ, as well as 2 smaller allocations toward Bitcoin and Ethereum. My question is, though, about VOO and maybe even UPRO. I know UPRO is a levered VOO position that you guys have spoken about in the past. Now, since this is a Roth IRA account, I definitely won't be able to touch it for at least 30 years or until I'm 59 and a half years old. So wouldn't it be wise to just move all of my VOO into UPRO just in my Roth account? I understand that this is riskier for a bridge account where I might want to move some of the money around before this 30-year time frame, but if our assumption is correct that the S&P 500 will continue to move up and to the right for years to come, aren't I technically leaving money on the table with an allocation in VOO instead of UPRO? I have a very high risk tolerance, but for a 30-year time frame, this doesn't even feel that risky to me. Any insight would be appreciated. I'm extremely grateful for the Rich Habits podcast and this awesome community that you guys have built. Robert, what a great question.
Fantastic. I can't wait to dig into this one.
So, Charles, you're 100% correct. UPRO is a levered position on VOO, which means that the gains you see in VOO, right, the S&P 500, on an annualized basis, daily basis, weekly basis, they are magnified to the upside and magnified to the downside, no matter what happens, right? So, for example, the S&P 500 this year is up 22%, which means that UPRO is up 62%, right? We're talking about a 3x leverage on the upside. But also that means 3x leverage on the downside. Another example of that was when we had that bear market in 2022. UPRO shares fell by 65% compared to the S&P 500's 20-ish%. Now, additionally, year to date, UPRO has fallen 25% in some instances, which happened late July, early August when we sort of had that flash crash. So, I mean, that is a 25% 2-week decline in your portfolio. Now, to your point, Charles, I understand what you're saying, right? You think that as long as we assume that American capitalism is going to be here for the next 30 years, which is correct, and the S&P 500 should continue to trend up and to the right, which is correct, if we put leverage on that upside, we should have a bigger gain in our portfolio. That is a correct assumption. I mean, we've talked about this before on the podcast, Robert. I still can't find a way or figure out, sort of even to steelman the opposite side of that as how to bet against URPO. It's a way to bet on American capitalism for a long period of time. The only reason this does not make sense, and which Charles, alluded to here, which is if it's in a bridge account and you need that money for the next 30 years. But since it's tied up in a Roth IRA and Charles won't be able to touch it for at least 30 years, 30 years is well a long enough time where, whatever volatility UPRO experiences, I'm positive it's going to be higher in 30 years than it is today. Now, the only downside risk I could possibly think of right now with this UPRO ETF is that the ETF doesn't exist in 30 years. That's it. And let me explain that, right? So with VOO is the Vanguard S&P 500 ETF. It is arguably the most popular S&P 500 ETF on the market, has over $1.3 trillion of assets invested inside of it. Vanguard is never going to get rid of this ETF because remember, ETFs are a business. These companies have to have the listing fees. They need management. They need to make sure that the strategy is actually getting implemented, compliance, right? There's a lot of things that go into making an ETF and they cost money every single year to run. Now, UPRO only has $4 billion in assets under management, right? $4 billion, 1.3 trillion, right? So just think about the difference there. So is UPRO theoretically going to perform well over the next 30 years? Yeah, totally could. And theoretically, it should continue to perform very well. But will the ETF be here in 30 years? I don't know. Maybe it loses assets under management. Maybe it just doesn't make sense for them as a business to have it anymore. Maybe ProShares goes out of business, right? I have no idea. Maybe they get acquired, right, by someone else and they don't want UPRO. So I'm all for it, Charles. Just be careful that UPRO is a ETF that maintains its integrity, its existence, and that if it ever does get liquidated into cash, you immediately reinvest that cash back into your portfolio?
I love this question and your breakdown. And the only thing that really comes to mind for me is diversity. People ask me all the time, you love Bitcoin. Why are you not just all in on Bitcoin? Take all of your money and put it on Bitcoin. One side of me says, I probably should do that because I believe one Bitcoin will be worth $250,000 to $500,000 in the coming years. And it's the same thing when we talk about the S&P 500. Every single day you have to ask yourself the question, is this the best place to put my money? So in this instance, the only reason I don't love this strategy in question is I like to be diversified so I can never go broke. And my fear is if you go too heavy in this, and let's say the S&P 500 and JP Morgan Chase is right, and the S&P 500 does go flat for years and years, because remember, there was an article, I think, last week where they said the average return for the next 10 years was going to be 3%. Well, then that would mean you would be only making, what would that be, 9% on your money, while there would be better places to make more money. So I like it. I would do it with a small portion. I own it, but I wouldn't go all in on UPRO because you just don't want to be in a situation where there is 2 or 3 bad years and it wipes out 60% of your gains for the last 10 years. And then all of a sudden that happens to be the time frame when you're getting your money out. So that's why I like diversity. I love UPRO, but I would keep it a small percentage of your portfolio.
Yeah, maybe there's a world, Robert, where, Charles here could split it up 70-30, right? So let's say you have $10,000 of that. I think it was 16,000 that he had mentioned here in his S&P 500. Let's say 10,000 of that was invested into VOO. Well, maybe here's an opportunity to put 7,000 in VOO and the other 3,000 in UPRO, right? It's sort of a 70-30 split there, allowing you to have some of this UPRO upside as well as continue to have the VOO diversification that just comes with the S&P 500. So really great question, Charles, and thank you so much for being a part of the Rich Habits Network.